Hello there, welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Today we're looking at growth in the US, whilst examining some of the finer details of what exactly is going on in the world's biggest economy as far as a business and trade perspective is concerned. In the studio with me today is Counsellor John Hancock from the World Trade Organization. John, welcome to the studio once again.
Great to be here.
Just for a second to avoid this talk of the so-called fiscal cliff, I know it's inevitable at some point. We've seen revised annualised growth in the US of 2.7% of late. What's driving, or rather holding back, this sluggish growth? Because, I mean, it's 2.7% is better, but it's not like, say, the 4% we saw perhaps over a year ago.
That's a very good question. This debate about the fiscal cliff, and I know we're not going to talk about it, has obscured other interesting studies and debates that have taken place in the United States. And one of the most interesting is the Congressional Budget Office recently issued a report that said, even under the most optimistic conditions right now, U.S. underlying growth could probably reach a maximum of 2% in the foreseeable future. And that contrasts with a 4% real underlying growth rate just as recently as 2000. So your question is pertinent. Why is this happening? And it suggests there's basic structural problems. There's a demographic trend, an aging workforce, a workforce that doesn't seem to have the skills or the educational requirements to meet labor market demands. There's been, strangely, a pattern of underinvestment in capital, in manufacturing capacity, in new technologies, corporations sitting on large stocks of cash without investing in the capital required to propel companies to the next level. So there's underlying reasons why we're seeing growth rates that are suboptimal or subpar.
Companies such as Apple, for instance, I mean, I know that these companies, particularly Apple, can sort of make waves themselves. I mean, I've seen Apple change growth figures in the US simply because of its size. But what about sort of smaller businesses, and how are they reacting in today's environment? And is there something perhaps deeper here as far as some of the problems and issues with America's growth today?
Well, there's this interesting dichotomy right now, or split between the reality of what's happening in the corporate sector, including amongst small companies, and perceptions of what's happening. Just recently, they released profitability figures for the corporate sector in the last quarter, which were up 18%, over 18% from the previous year. This is a historic high. Corporate profits now amount to a bigger share of GDP than at any point in recent history, in the last 100 years. So the corporate sector is actually doing very well in the US.
Even though the business confidence is the lowest we've seen in
Precisely,
years.
Thomas. You know, you got this bizarre fact where they're doing extraordinarily well and they think they're doing very badly. So it's a mix of fear, uncertainty in the current climate, of an inability to see far into the future, as if there's fog in front of the windscreen. And I think that's clouding perceptions of what's really happening at the ground level for the corporate sector. You
know, we said we'd avoid talking about the fiscal cliff. I think there's no way we're really not going to be able to avoid talking about it. There'll be some element of it, and this so-called fiscal cliff. The term itself is fairly negative. I remember we were just talking about that before the interview, the idea of the US literally falling over a cliff. Wall Street is still pretty volatile. There's talk of, you know, next year being over $600 billion worth of tax hikes and cuts. With this in mind, which industries do you think in the US will help to provide better growth levels? And also, not just the industries, but do you feel that there may be a much deeper sort of restructuring needing to go on in the US for there to be a greater growth levels?
Well, those are tough questions, but good questions. I mean, you're absolutely right. If one of government's jobs is to instill confidence and a sense of leadership and direction, then words like the fiscal cliff are not going to do that. As a matter of fact, they just create panic and fear. And I think underlying that language is the reality that government itself doesn't have a clear roadmap for the future. You know, when you dig beneath the surface of this debate, there's not just political gridlock in Washington, there's an ideological gridlock that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans seem to have a grip on what they would do to pull the United States out of what they see as being this period of uncertainty? Do you spend or do you cut? Is it Keynes or is it von Hayek? And their answer typically is a little bit of both. We're going to give with the left hand, but we're going to take with the right. And it's created a sense of uncertainty and paralysis. And maybe it's because, economists, like old generals, are always, old generals are always fighting the last war. Economists are always fighting the last recession. They seem to are treating this problem like a cyclical problem, and really it's an underlying structural problem, the kind of things we discussed earlier. High corporate profits, but high corporate uncertainty. Huge transformations in the labor market where you get labor market shortfalls, but high unemployment.
You mentioned economists there. I mean, the economists like Tyler Cowen has said that, the US could perhaps could start better, greater, looser monetary policy, reform the patent law, and interestingly, he mentioned as well a couple of months back that, actually no, it was about a year ago actually, he mentioned that there could be a possibility that the US should reform its education system, and that was causing some of the issues with development and growth in the US, that the education system just wasn't backing up the job sector and providing perhaps the necessary skills.
I think one of the most interesting things about economists like Tyler Cowen, that they're prepared to put radical solutions on the table, which doesn't seem to fit well with our current political class. And this isn't just a US problem, it's a problem across the industrialized world. We're seeing it in Europe. There's a fear of doing dramatic things. There's a fear of change. So you want the benefits of high growth, but you don't want the costs of structural adjustment. You want the benefits of innovation, but you don't want to change anything that's required to make that innovation possible. I mean, that famous, you want to talk about famous economists, the Schumpeter line, all capitalism is a form of creative destruction. You can't have the creativity without destroying something. And unfortunately, our political class right now seems to be doing everything they possibly can to avoid that churn, to avoid the change. And Tyler Cowen's thrown some very interesting ideas into the mix.
Interesting. Perhaps maybe we just need some more radicals on the table. Maybe that will get some change.
Yeah, maybe we should vote him to Congress. Who knows?
That'd be good. That'd be good. John, thanks very much for coming in the studio once again.
Nice to be here.
It's been great to see you again. That's all from Dukascopy TV. I'll be back later with further interviews, but stay tuned for the latest updates. Until next time, goodbye.